So here in this little video, we're going to talk about the macromolecule called carbohydrates. So macromolecules, 3 out of the 4 of them, are built in this repeating monomer and polymer fashion. So when we talk about carbohydrates, their monomer is one single sugar called glucose. Now, but the general term for single sugar is actually monosaccharide, where saccharide is going to mean sugar. So in this PowerPoint, we're going to use glucose as our monosaccharide, but I should point out there are other monosaccharides like fructose and galactose. So a monosaccharide is one sugar, but the sugar we are going to talk about is glucose, because that's what we use to balance our blood sugar. When we talk about homeostasis and blood sugar, we're talking about glucose. When we talk about starch or glycogen, we talk about any type of carbohydrates, we're usually dealing with glucose. Okay, so now, again, the monomer of carbohydrates is a monosaccharide, one single sugar, and the single sugar that we are going to use as our example is glucose. So when we look at carbohydrates, I want you to check yourself. What's the monomer? Good, a monosaccharide called glucose. So saccharide, remember, means sugar. So on Earth, though, what do we have to build these monosaccharides? And this is where the beauty of photosynthesis comes into play. So plants are amazing organisms that are able to take abiotic or not living things, carbon dioxide and water, and through the power of the sun are able to rearrange these atoms, the C, H, and O from carbon dioxide and water, and they rearrange them into a molecule of glucose. So when I look at glucose here in this picture, I can see the C, H, and O. So I'm going to pause right here and I'm going to repeat what I just said. So plants, they are able to take carbon dioxide and water, and through the process of photosynthesis, in photosynthesis, the plants' chloroplasts, their organelles in the cells, are going to take the CO2 and the H2O, and they're going to break those bonds and rearrange them into glucose. So here, this glucose is our animal or heterotroph source of energy. So really what's happening in photosynthesis is the sun's energy is what drives and is used to help to break the bonds apart and rearrange it into glucose. But now as humans, when we eat that glucose, that's how we get our energy. We cannot go stand in the sun and get energy that way. So here, the plant taking CO2, carbon dioxide, and water from our air and rearranging it into this carbohydrate is a beautiful process, because that is really the reactions that make life on Earth as we know it possible. So here, this molecule, this glucose, I always just show it as an orange hexagon. But in reality, our carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from that carbon dioxide and water. And it was through the power of the sun that drove the reactions that rearranged those atoms and those molecules. So, to summarize, plants are able to do photosynthesis and take carbon dioxide and water from the air and the soil, and they rearrange it into a molecule of glucose made of C, H, and O. Now, plants, they don't just stop at glucose, right? So as they do photosynthesis, this is energy for us when we eat the plant, but it's also energy for the plant. So plant's going to want to save this extra sugar. It's going to save these extra monosaccharides called glucose. And when they save them, they form a chain. So each individual glucose is a monomer, but when the plant stores them together in a chain for later, we call this a polysaccharide, because saccharide means sugar. So when you have a chain of sugars, that is now many sugars hooked together. This is the polymer of plants, or of animals too, and we call this a polysaccharide. So while the monomer of carbohydrates is glucose, a single sugar, a monosaccharide, the polymer is going to be a chain of glucose molecules, a chain of monosaccharides, repeating over and over and over and over again. We call this a many saccharides. So here, many saccharide, polysaccharide. Examples, hold on, I'm going to move my face real fast. Here, a starch is a very common polysaccharide in plants. That's how plants are going to store their energy for long term. When you eat a potato, when you eat rice, when you eat bread, when you eat pasta, you are eating starch. And that starch is a polysaccharide that your body breaks down and uses for energy. Now, when your blood sugar is high and you eat these polysaccharides, you're going to save your own sugar as glycogen. So glycogen is the animal polysaccharide. We store extra sugar in our liver in the form of glycogen. Then plants, because they get to build themselves out of air and water and nutrients from the soil, they will actually chain together glucose molecules into their cell walls, and that's cellulose. So cellulose is what's going to make plant cell walls, and that gives them structure and support. So when we look at some functions of carbohydrates, I'm going to go ahead and move my face again real fast. When we look at the functions of carbohydrates, we see that they're one of our main sources of energy. So when we talk about sugar in life, sugar is our source of energy. And our mitochondria, which often is referred to as the powerhouse of the cell, will actually take that sugar and break apart the bonds, and in the process release ATP, which is our cellular energy. So when we eat our carbs, we use them for energy. However, when we look at how do we store these, so plants will store their energy as starch. So starch is the long polymer for energy for plants. And then when we eat those, sorry, that's French fries behind my face, but when we eat those potatoes or we eat that rice, that is the energy we get from our carbohydrates. So here, when we talk about starch in potatoes, for example, that is going to be one long polymer. But plants also get to build themselves. So when they use the glucose to build their cell walls, we call that cellulose. And that's for structure and support. So when I look at here, when I look at the two polysaccharides in plants, we have one that is used for energy storage. That's starch, energy storage for plants. And then we also have cellulose, which is used for structure and support or for cell walls. Now, when I want to kind of summarize what we've learned so far about carbohydrates, the monomer of carbohydrates is a monosaccharide. And then the polymer of carbohydrates is a chain of these glucose molecules called a polysaccharide. Oops. Let's move this again. Is called a polysaccharide. Now those examples of a polysaccharide include starch, cellulose, and glycogen in animals.